Our next speaker is absolutely here to shine a light on how the travel and tourism industry can be a genuine engine of opportunity from people from all walks of life. To truly understand what social mobility is and what it looks like in action, we need to go beyond theory and into the lived experience of communities often left behind. And we've heard a lot about that as the day's gone on. Natasha Ereira-Guyer is the founder-director of Civil Society Consulting, a non-profit organisation dedicated to empowering grassroots groups and advancing health, equality and social cohesion across the UK. From refugee education to community-led movements, from Parliament to the UN, Natasha brings both a global perspective and a deep local insight. Her work is all about shifting power to those best placed to drive change. Please join me in welcoming Natasha to the stage.
Oh, so nice to be introduced. Thank you so much. And thanks for doing all the hard work of gathering everyone's attention. Yeah, no, it didn't look easy. So yes, so lovely to be here. What an honour to introduce this important topic. So yeah, I'm here as your social mobility expert and not so much a travel and tourism expert. So I'll come clean with that at the beginning. And I'm here to sort of warm your brains up and think about what social mobility is, how it's a tool to change and improve the world, and then lead us on for sort of thinking about how travel and tourism can contribute to social mobility. It's a deep dive, that's what I've been tasked with. So besides introducing the topic, I'm going to get you thinking critically and deeply about it. So as a bit of a heads up, I'm kind of thinking, you know, what is the point in helping individual players move around an unequal system? It's really the system that needs to change. And perhaps really we need to think collectively, sort of taking our attention off helping individuals cope with the system, with the symptoms of a broken system, and start, you know, creating a system that doesn't create those problems in the first place. And that's sustainability, right? A system that doesn't create problems that we then need to kind of rush to solve. So with that in mind, the question is going to sort of become, how can we make sure that social mobility leads to systems change? And I hope that sets us up for a really rich and fabulous discussion with the amazing panel. And that's the juicy and important stuff. So thank you so much for the introduction. I was going to also briefly introduce myself. So my name's Natasha. I am the founder director, one of 3 founder directors of an amazing organisation called Civil Society Consulting. And we're basically like a charity that supports charities. So since austerity in the UK and the time since, charities and community groups have done an incredible job of filling the gaps in public services to support people in communities. And we exist to support those organisations by being a reliable source of very cheap but very good consultancy support. And we also support hyper-local grassroots organisations for free so that they can grow and continue to do their fantastic work. And that's because those organisations are particularly good at reaching those who are most let down by the system. So my history was more international, but now I come with quite a UK lens. And I myself have a deeply interdisciplinary academic background. And I think being interdisciplinary has really taught me to think very much in terms of the whole system, not in terms of isolated problems that are in fact all interlinked. Systems are ultimately made up of people, and if you want to understand people and people's behaviour, you need to understand our evolutionary history. So my academic background has been sort of focused on that, and besides our work as an organisation, I'm an evolutionary psychiatrist at Cambridge, doing a PhD looking at improving social mobility by supporting mothers and parents, and in particular supporting them to build communities. So very proud of and excited about that. So through our work as an organisation, we've seen the importance of addressing the causes of problems rather than just treating the symptoms of them, which, you know, always puts us on the back foot if we're treating symptoms rather than tackling the real issues. We've developed a conceptual framework for thinking about how to create the conditions for systems change. So that we can try and eliminate the underlying structures that create so many of the world's problems. And we've basically come to the conclusion that we're living in a hyper-capitalistic system that brings about widespread disconnection and atomization, and that creates widespread loneliness. That loneliness is really bad for our health, and that's sort of a whole deep dive that we could do another day. It's bad for our health, mental and physical, but it also creates the conditions for division and polarization, because sadly some of the symptoms of loneliness can include paranoia, distrust and anger, low self-esteem, and basically just makes us more susceptible to feelings of hate and intolerance. And that can, I sometimes joke, that can slightly lead to kind of cliqueiness at best, or full-blown, far-right extremism at worst. Yeah, that division, and much of which is stoked by certain politicians, then undermines our ability to work together at different levels, so within organisations, but as a society as a whole, because we've got and therefore undermines our ability to change the system. So we've got lots of disempowered individuals and no solidarity across communities. So to create the conditions for change, we need to intercept this vicious cycle by trying to build connections within communities, between communities, within and between sectors, as events like this show, even though that can feel really difficult in the current system. So my message here is connection is so important for creating meaningful change, and I could hear that coming through in the panel that I just enjoyed before. And I think that's why Alessandra asked me to introduce the topic, because her work's brought her to a similar conclusion. It's all about connection. So now social mobility. What is social mobility, and why does it matter? So social mobility in the purest sense is the movement and ability to move up or indeed down in a socioeconomic system, which in a country like the UK is a class system, and many other countries too. And you can kind of look at it through different lenses. So you could look at it through a financial lens, social, cultural, or sort of more of a physical lens, because they've got factors. You've got factors that determine social mobility in those different areas. So if you were to take a sort of purely financial lens to social mobility, you might find yourself trying to remove financial barriers that people have to accessing education and health, and you might sort of try and create loans and bursaries and subsidies, or you might try and make education free or healthcare free. If you were to take a more sort of social lens to social mobility, you might be thinking about things that you can do to create role models and connect people with useful contacts and creating useful relationships. So might be mentorship or networking opportunities. And there's some interesting research that's come out recently to show that friendships in places where there's more friendship across class divides, there's high levels of social mobility. So that sort of says it all. If you were to take more of a cultural lens, you might be thinking about the mismatch between the values that we absorb in our home lives versus the values that we see in the institutions around us. And you can imagine maybe somebody whose home culture doesn't really align well to the expectations that school puts upon them, and then they've got a sense of alienation, lower engagement, and gradually over time that sort of affects what person that you become. But also potentially the values at home might not value the things that you really love. So it might mean that you don't have the opportunity to develop the creative part of yourself, and you might find yourself in a career that doesn't really play to your strengths or the things that you love. And I think in a country like the UK that's so geographically unequal, where you live, geography plays a huge part in that cultural side of things. So you might be looking at doing trips to heritage sites, trips to different cities, and that might make you think of travel. Certainly made me think of travel. And then on the physical side, I've sort of thought of things, there's the physical things that are internal to us, so nutrition, feeling comfortable in your body. These things help us to kind of overcome barriers. But then there's the more structural physical things like transport and air quality. So these are the different lenses we can take to social mobility: financial, social, cultural, and physical. And there's also lots of different entry points that you can sort of take in a life cycle. So you could work with young adults. You could try and work with people when they're teenagers. You could try and go back a step and work with people when they're children, or even try and work with parents. And I believe that's where you can kind of make the most difference, because then you're working with a child and a whole family from day zero, and you're also able to sort of harness all of that energy that a parent has, you know, through loving their child, and they can sort of, you know, by capturing that energy in the sails of your proverbial boat, you can, a little support goes a long way if you work with parents. So that's something I'm really passionate about. So that's what social mobility is. Why does it matter? I think intuitively we know it matters because of justice, because it's what's fair. It's simply not fair that your birth would determine your ability to reach your potential. And it's certainly not fair that these things might be fixed for many, many generations. So social mobility is often about kind of intercepting this intergenerational transfer of poverty and class. And then, interestingly, but probably not unsurprisingly, social mobility is also really good for productivity. So having a society where social mobility is possible, where you can move up or down in the ranks, keeps us on our toes, and there's research showing it's good for productivity. It also, of course, helps make sure that the best talent ends up, you know, where that talent's needed, which is important too. But as I said, we're going to be thinking critically. And social mobility does have some criticisms. So focusing on social mobility sort of can create a bit of a blind spot. So if you're focusing on helping people move up in an unequal system, be that through beautiful mentoring programs and wonderful development opportunities, that runs the risk of kind of implicitly saying that the unequal system is okay. So social mobility can be sort of more about shuffling people around, but not necessarily changing the fabric of a system. You know, you change a few people at the top, so a few people with generational wealth slip down. Like, what does that really do in terms of scaled impact? And kind of going one step further, I suppose, besides being a bit of a distraction, social mobility can run the risk of sort of actively protecting the system as well, because it reinforces a fallacy of meritocracy. So, you know, if you hear these amazing stories of people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps out of the gutter, it kind of feeds narratives, this narrative that we're living in a meritocracy and therefore the system's okay because it's fair. And that's not really true. It takes a lot more than merit to excel in today's world. And I think as I was preparing for this and thinking about it, I was thinking the big things is definitely economic and the financial stuff, and relationships, the social. But as a scientist, I believe that we're all a product of our experience, and people's ability to overcome some of those barriers really rests on certain factors that they had right in their childhood. And that doesn't mean to say they necessarily have to have the most rosy, perfect childhood. It might include some hardships that make you, you know, be thrifty or be determined and make you who you are. But ultimately, a certain number of factors combine well and combine well enough to help you be that 1 in 1,000. So to use my own example to kind of emphasize that point, I certainly have the sensation at times that I've taught myself everything I know, but that's not really true, is it? I've benefited from the amazing state schools from the late 90s and early noughties. Wonderful teachers who were supported and paid and put their time into me and enjoyed doing so. I had parents that taught me how to teach myself, all those things I've taught myself, and gave me love and self-worth by, you know, saying, wow, that's amazing when I produce a picture of something, you know, family portrait. They'd be amazed at my artwork, and that led me to develop resilience, yada, yada. And also, you know, when my parents were imperfect, I had a community, and I think that's really important too. So I had grandparents, I had local activities, and that gave me perspective and cushioning when my parents maybe weren't perfect. So before we go on to talk about social mobility, I think it's important to acknowledge the limitations. However, social mobility can contribute to systems change, and that's by increasing the representation of diverse voices and experience within institutions, and particularly within leadership. That can lead to policy changes and cultural changes and a change in attitudes and norms. And I think we do see that around us. You know, we live in a very negative time, and I think that's a positive we can kind of cling on to. And I think this really gets to the nub of why social mobility matters. That's what we need to be aiming for. So how do we make sure social mobility leads to systems change, not just this sort of shuffling around exercise? Sorry, I meant to change the slide before. I love this graphic. This is from the School of Life, anyone who knows it. There's a risk there, right? You shuffle everyone around, nothing changes. You know, the system has an unfortunate habit of looking all right once you've got to the top of it. And I think that's why connection is so important. So kind of coming back to what I was saying before about connection and community and our model for systems change, if people who have risen in the ranks of an organisation or of the social hierarchy in general, if they stay connected to where they came from and the people and experiences that got them there, they can become agents of change. So I suppose my message here is that social mobility plus connection equals systems change. And I think that's where social mobility gets very exciting. So then the last bit, which I will whiz through, the next point is why travel? So as I said, I'm not so much of a travel expert. My personal background prior to founding CSC, Civil Society Consulting, was in international development, and we did a bit of work on the East Africa tourism industry. And that's where I lived, and I've done language teaching. So like, I suppose, everybody, I'm not a million miles away from the travel and tourism industry. But so preparing for this, I really got to thinking about why travel, and travel is amazing. I really understand Alessandra's passion. So I think there's a distinction to make between what travel can do for the people that work in the sector and what travel can do for everyone, travellers, and you know, the people as the people. So the sector has sort of low barriers to entry, and I think that's really crucial. So by making the sector inclusive, an inclusive place to work, that can directly enable social mobility using the sector as a vehicle. But then there's also everything that travel can do for people who travel. So travel opens your mind, it's good for your well-being, it exposes you to new perspectives, new cultures, for cognitive and emotional growth, helps you overcome some of those barriers you might be facing as somebody at the lower end of, you know, somebody who we want to be socially mobile. And as I was saying to one of our wonderful panelists, I think there's something, the experiences that we gain from traveling can kind of be an incredible substitute for formal education. And I think that's really crucial. The bit I find most exciting is about how travel enables connection. And, you know, being able to connect with people is like a muscle that you strengthen. And the more that you travel, the more that you experience people different from you and people from all walks of life, the more that we all strengthen that muscle. And it, you know, breaks down barriers and helps to build that solidarity. So I'm very excited for the panel. And I hope that kind of warms us up for a great discussion. I'll leave you with, for anyone who is not maybe in a position where they can make decisions and change things in their organisation, I'll leave you with these 32 steps that we can all take to try and foster more connection in our lives. Yay, you're all taking pictures. That's lovely. So they're things that we can all do, you know, within our organisations, within our communities. So yes.
Thank you, Natasha.